Thanks, Tammy. Yeah, so if there's any questions, just put them directly into the chat or send them to Tom or Tammy and they'll pass them on to me. So I've got one question here already. It says, do you know of any validation on how accurate the built-in hand tracking of the Oculus Quest is? And that's just for anybody who might know that.
I think I already gave my answer to this, so I guess it's for someone else.
Thank you.
So I know that my supervisor, Gavin Buckingham's looking into a lot of this stuff at the moment. He unfortunately had to go about 20 minutes ago, but from my understanding of it, is that there's a lot of testing ongoing for this stuff at the moment. A lot of these hand tracking features are obviously quite new, and each of the companies are coming up with their own ways of doing this and different ways of approaching it. In particular, also how you then provide haptic feedback and some of those things as well. So I know it's an area that's going to be really pivotal. Gavin's given some brilliant talks recently about how it's a crucial sort of step moving forward for a lot of training related stuff.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question here, if no one else has anything to add to that. It says, regarding the emerging issues of definitions in VR research in general, should the immersion of the tech used be addressed and treated as an integral aspect of the methodological description of the experiment or intervention used?
Can you just say that again, Rebecca? Sorry, just interested in that.
Yeah,
mind
sure.
repeating?
Sorry, I was doing quite quickly there. It says, regarding the emerging issue of definitions in VR research in general, should the immersion of the tech used be addressed and treated as an integral aspect of the methodological description of the experiment or intervention used?
Just as I happen to have my speaker off, yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think when I review, the more and more work I review, I see a lack of description of the things you've just mentioned, immersion and the hardware and the software and all those sort of factors. I think are really important in being able to replicate work. And certainly being able to understand what the work sought to achieve and how it sought to achieve it. I think there's often that detail missing. So I very much would welcome those aspects being included more and more in work of this nature. And especially if we're, again, coming back to my idea of translating research into practice, if we're to understand how people have reached their findings and how that work can potentially be adapted and adopted into practical settings, we definitely need to know those sort of details. And especially as immersion can also play into ethical sort of issues as well. Do we want autistic people to be exposed to very highly realistic material, or can it be less realistic? Could it scare them if it's very realistic and immersive, for example? So there's all those issues as well, I think, at play that need careful consideration. But that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Well, I think that is interesting, but on the other hand, there is the challenge of having new, it's very lucky this time that there is new hardware coming out all the time, improving, changing, very affordable. There has been a decrease of prices of many orders of magnitude in the last decades. And on the other hand, it's not realistic to think that one is going to do a whole quantification of every aspect with every new hardware. So, for example, what we try to do is to have a software that is very easily and very fast adaptable to the different hardware that comes. Yeah, I think one has to be ready to adapt to the new hardware, because there is going to be always improvements and advantages, but your life would go into doing new quantifications of every aspect in every new one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I asked this question just because it's very close to heart for me, especially because I think it's something that Matthew and a few other speakers have mentioned previously, just because now VR has became, like Ria said, cheaper and more accessible. I think the whole question of the idea of having it very technocentric and thinking, well, are we talking about immersion and thinking only about the hardware, while we talk about immersion is the experience. And I think these are two strands that are somehow separating within the research, because the hardware such as HMD VR is becoming more accessible. And I think at least when I first came as a PhD student into this area of virtual reality, it became very hard to find the papers you were actually looking for, the research you're looking for, because the terminology was so unclear as to what people meant by calling it virtual reality. So whether they're referring to the feeling of immersion or they were referring to the hardware. I think that's where kind of my concern is from where we moving forward. And I think Matthew alluded to that in his talk as well, as to moving forward, especially whether it's in psychology in general or autism research, wherever we're using VR, I think it's important to ensure that we are describing this in the methodology. So not so much the actual technical details, but what we mean by virtual reality. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you for all those viewpoints. I've got another question here. How much are we using VR because it's a new and exciting tool, and how much is it used because it's actually a useful tool and something that other tech that we've got currently can't do?
Well, that's very interesting. I think it's important when one works with VR is to do things that really it makes sense to use VR. So one has to take the advantages of the media, and it's important to design the studies properly to take the full advantage of the media. So I agree with sometimes if it can be done in the real world, why doing it in the virtual world? It may have advantages because you may have a more standardized, very consistent situation for everyone. So if it makes sense from the experimental design point of view, then I think VR has many advantages. And of course, it's going to allow so I think the nice thing is to be able to do whatever you cannot do in the real world. So if you want to do someone doing impossible things in the real world, then you have to use VR. But of course, it's like a dream for an experimenter, because you have a very consistent environment totally under your control and so on. But I agree that if it can be done very well in the real world, then we don't need, because you don't need to create all these. I mean, there are things that cannot be done, like correlations with physical objects that are difficult. So if it can be done in the real world, do it in the real world.
I think I would just also add to that, I endorse that idea, but I think to add to that, what might be impossible for somebody with autism might be quite different. So for example, the idea of going onto a crowded train or going into an interview scenario or making coffee in a coffee shop, for example, might be actually a hugely difficult thing for somebody, an autistic person, to achieve. So I think what's impossible, whether or not we heard from the earlier talk about the idea of doing training in nuclear power stations, which of course would be difficult to replicate maybe in the real world, but they can be done in in VR. But I think we need to bear in mind different things for different people prove to be barriers, and I think again we need to understand and listen to to those communities to understand what those might be. But I agree. I think we don't use VR for the sake of using it. I think there is a special property that VR offers and brings through immersion and ecological validity and presence that we really could be quite powerful. And with the devices becoming more affordable, smaller, more adaptable, I think we really are in a good space to see this actually take off this time, as opposed to the 90s when it fell flat on its face with the costs, the sizes, and the expertise required to to develop this stuff. But again, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you both. I think Tom's got a question next that he'd like to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rebecca. So one thing that I've picked up on lots of different talks today was like levels of individual variability. Maria, I first wanted to just ask you how much variability in some of the studies surrounding presence and embodiment, how much you see in VR, because for me that must surely be an issue if we're seeing how do we move forwards if there's some people that just don't simply feel as immersed as other people. Is there a way in which we could maybe shape VR so it's more universal, or do we have to accept that there's going to be lots of individual variability and that we have to adjust things accordingly?
Well, I mean, there is a variability, obviously. If some people, I mean, I think basically I would say in general terms, VR is going to work. And I mean, I'm talking about, not talking about autistic because it's a population that I don't know. But I think generally VR works for everybody, okay, at some level. Then you can say, okay, maybe in embodiment there can be more variability. Which there may be. We have seen, I mean, just to give you an example, we have seen that people that are very, very aware of their body, for example, ballerinas or yoga experts, they have very high awareness of their body. They have more difficulty for embodiment. In a way, when embodiment is based on being so basically visual and so on dominates, and it works because proprioception is usually taken over by visual, which is a very dominant input, and also visotactile and so on. But people that are very aware of their proprioception, their position, they are always very alert on this, they can have this difficulty to have. So there is an interpersonal variability, but in general terms, I think anyone in virtual reality, I mean, if they don't have inputs coming from anywhere else, the general working is going to function for everyone. I don't find realistic that there should be an adaptation unless you are talking a specific population with a specific deficit or difference, and then one could adapt to that specific population if they have a certain issue, you know, because there is, of course, there is people that may be deaf, or they may have like some, you know, have some deficit in some sensory. Then there could be an adaptation, of course, and I think there is in those cases. But other than that, in the general population, I think generally it works, but there is going to be a difference. Yeah. Also, when there is, I mean, if there is a resistance for this to work, then I mean, it's like with movies, no?
Thank you. That's really interesting. Can I just jump in as well then and bounce that onto Nigel and say, earlier you talked about how it seems to be particularly, the presence seems to be particularly good actually within autistic people. Do you tend to see a lot of variance there, or do you also see relatively positive effect?
I suppose I wouldn't have a definitive answer, and I haven't investigated it with any sort of systematically approach that. I don't think so. It'd be unfair for me to say that, but or to answer that. I think in that way, but you know, I think we see some really interesting responses to how autistic young people, especially, respond to virtual environments and the immersion and presence therein. So we see them reaching for objects in the space, for example, trying to touch things in the space. We see them trying to jump off things in the virtual space, but falling over in the real world. So we do see a very strong connection in a safe and way that they didn't hurt themselves. But we do see a complete belief that they're in that space for many of them. So, but we've only measured it through the the sense of presence inventories and and tools like that. So it's self-reported sense of presence. But no, we do see very high reports of presence in these spaces, which again leads us to believe that things like generalization may well be something that we can start to move closer towards when we see those those heightened levels. And they're certainly heightened when compared to traditional screen-based media. So these are all thumbs up for me in terms of things moving in the right direction, that continues to allow us and to at least lead us to believe that this is that there is further promise and and further work to be done in this space. But further work is needed. I would definitely underscore.
Okay, thank you. I think David's got a question next.
I do, yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Bearing in mind there's a lot of young researchers present, One of the issues I think we've got with this particular field is where to publish. You know, there are the autism journals, but they're very, very fussy about things like diagnostic status and that sort of thing. Then there's the technical journals, which again are one option, but not always interested in the specifics of what we're doing. So, and obviously, Maria, in your work, you've obviously addressed some really big theoretical issues and done that very well and got into more general higher impact journals in particular. So I just wondered what the panel thought about where to send stuff, because it's certainly something that the work I'm doing with Sharona and Rebecca and Elliot, we're sort of thinking, well, where do we, it's not obvious where we send this research, which journals.
That is an absolutely, yeah, that's a superb observation, and it's one I would echo, and I'm afraid I don't have any answers, because my work often bounces between several different disciplines, as you allude to, I think, and it doesn't sit here, it doesn't sit there, it sits somewhere in between, and there isn't at the moment many outlets for this type of work, which means you often end up having to tailor what you're writing or what you want, or what you have to output to a specific audience, you know, that speaks to autism or technology. As you say, they're either interested in one or the other, not necessarily both together. So it's a tough one, and it's one I haven't broken and I don't have any answers to, I'm afraid. There are not many interdisciplinary journals out there. I mean, journals like Computers and Education, you know, is a space I would sort of identify with. My own journal, the Journal of Enabling Technologies, is something that very much sort of looks to bring together interdisciplinary work. So please do consider that as a space. But beyond that, the gold standards of JAD, you know, and autism as journals, where we would like to see some of our work, are, you know, can be a bit restricted in terms of, as you say, having to have the diagnosis reported and the IQ reported and all these specifics, which we don't always capture or need to capture. But I don't know if others have any advice, because I'd be glad to receive it as well, in terms of where we could put this work. Maybe we need to design our own journal. Maybe that's something to think about, where we could start, because that's why I'm so excited about this conference, that it's so focused on this particular subject, because, you know, it almost feels like it needs a journal to kind of focus on the specific subject, because it is attracting so much.
A special issue is an option, I guess, that can kick things off.
It can be, and I think JAD and autism have both had those, have both had special issues focusing on technology, which can be one route. But, you know, you end up finding yourself looking out for those all the time, and, you know, it's not necessarily a drip of where you can go to. It's, you know, it's on the odd occasion when those things happen, and then we can all be fighting. You know, there could be 25, 30, 40 articles all fighting for the space of, you know, of about, you know, 5 or 6 maybe in the final, you know, in the final issue. So there's that challenge. But yeah, I would welcome any other thoughts or advice on that very, very pertinent question.
Yeah, it's complicated. This is my experience too, because it's across different disciplines, and then we end up often in scientific reports and in this kind of more journalistic journals, because they are across disciplines. Of course, this is not the case when we do studies on pain, and then we can go to pain journals. I particularly like Frontiers. I don't know if you like Frontiers in virtual reality, for example. My experience in Frontiers is that papers get a lot of visibility and get cited quite well. So in that sense, I think it's.
But it's also very expensive.
This, I think, well, there is this idea around, but my experience is that, I mean, I publish in other neuroscience journals, for example, and I pay a lot more. Okay. So they cost some money. I mean, the cost of being open access, which now anyway is mandatory if one has European projects and so on. But really my experience is that they get cited well, and they get viewed very well. So it's one venue that I think. Also there are many options, and one can make all these research topics, but then the general ones like scientific reports, +1, this kind of more general ones, but it's problematic. With every paper we have to think where to go because of this being in between disciplines. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tammy has got a question next.
I just have a question, just kind of rolling off of the idea from Irene, that she said that for the rubber hand illusion, it takes people with autism longer to get into that illusion. I just wondered if anybody has any interesting thoughts as to why that might be.
I don't know if there can be a concentration or attention problem, for example. That could
I was
be
thinking
a
potential
potential explanation.
adaptation to a different body perhaps might be difficult over a short period. Maybe they take time to get used to it.
Or maybe
Perhaps.
some multisensory integration deficit could be also. So I mean,
and theory of mind weighing may well play a part as well.
Okay, so it's all different things, I suppose, that kind of contribute to it.
One thing I've wondered about recently, actually, in response, there's been a little cluster of talks at Glasgow that have sort of featured on these things, because I think maybe somebody that worked with you gave a talk just a few days. Solène Néré, did she work with you?
who?
Solène Néré.
Not with me, but she worked in the group. Yeah.
In the group, yeah. And I wonder if it's about this synchronization idea, and that maybe, because we know that in autism sometimes timing can be a little bit different, and that maybe if the synchronization of, for example, the visuomotor synchronization or the audio-visual synchronization is just a little bit out, then it can take longer for some things to happen that rely on that synchronization. It seems to me that the rubber hand illusion is one example where you need to get things synchronized. And so if there are, you know, as I've argued elsewhere, if there are sort of slight timing differences in neural signaling, for example, then that could easily lead to different behavior in that situation. So that's just thinking out loud, really. But
I think this is what I had in mind with this integration, that there can be this problem to put these two sensory streams together with the proper timing and so on. That could be something apart from the attention to be able to get that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple more questions here. So this one's asking, there's been some research questions about using VR avatars which do not resemble our own bodies. Is this something which can be useful, and how would it affect our embodiment?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting issue. We have now we've done studies comparing with the real, you can have the real avatar, your real personalized avatar, only the face with photographs, or a full body scan in a more precise way. Basically, my comment on this would be, okay, you don't need, and part of what we have found is that you can embody anybody. So does it mean you are going to embody better one that looks exactly like you? This is not always straightforward, and sometimes it can play against you. So it depends very much what is the objective of the embodiment. So I've seen the opposite. I've seen that that people have a successful embodiment, and they tend to think that the avatar looks like them physically, or this used to be described already just for the rubber hand, that people feel the rubber hand looks like their hand. So there is some kind of distortion of the image. And then you encounter there a different problem, which is what is the internal image that we all have of ourselves, which doesn't correspond precisely with our own image perceived by the others. So what I mean by this is that there were some studies done in our group doing very subtle distortion of a face, for example, in an avatar. And people don't always identify with their most realistic face. So this means that there is a certain mismatch between our internal representation of our own face and the one that is perceived from the outside. So what this means is that it may play against, because small differences may be more shocking for you. And the same is if you are interacting with someone that can be maybe a representation of your partner or so, you are going to be more sensitive to the differences. So this is something we have now the capability to have very accurate avatars, but depending on what is the objective, it's not always obvious that it's going to be better. So it's an area that a lot of research can be done on that, but it's not very straightforward that I'm going to get very well embodied if it is my real body, because maybe I see the internal representation, maybe one feels is much better looking or much younger or have a much better body. So it doesn't always fit.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question, and I think this is going to be our last one unless anyone else has got any pressing questions. So following up on the immersion issue, how do we handle the ethical issues which arise from VR, which current standards are not designed for?
Wow, it's a huge question, isn't it, I think? And I think it comes back to the point that was raised about, do we need to capture things like immersion and other stuff in our methodologies and capture our processes? And I think for me, it comes down to that. I think this is an emerging area, and I just think we need to potentially promote reporting on what we're doing and how we're doing it that led to successful outcomes, which can, again, often not be the focus of the paper, but it can often be an outcome of the work. So I think somehow we need to just bear in mind. So, for example, some of the work I've developed, I've reported, the findings of some of the research questions over here, but I've also seen the need to report sort of the ethical implications of the work that have arisen and the ways that we work to enable things, or the things that came up that we needed to deal with that others might learn from. Because I think you're right, we've been talking about this before with PhD students I supervise. There's no kind of book you can take off the shelf that can help you with the sort of ethical dilemmas and issues when you work in this space, other than the very general sort of BERA guidelines, for example. But there is no real guidance in this space, and I do think it's lacking. So I just think it's a combination of working carefully, reviewing practices, probably having a very tight risk assessment of some of this stuff, around this stuff, and then just monitoring what you're doing, capturing stuff as you go, and then maybe thinking or being encouraged to then report that back into the field so we can learn from that. But it's a tricky one, and I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add to that. But ethics is, a thing I'm very passionate about, and a thing that I think is very important, especially in this space, and especially working with younger vulnerable groups as I do. It's especially important. But that would be my view on it. I don't think there's any quick fix to it, but I think it's something that as this field emerges, we need to continue reporting and continue seeing researchers capture how they successfully navigate this space, or when they don't navigate this space, also reporting on what those issues were.
Okay, does anyone have anything else? Because that will wrap it if not. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And I really enjoyed listening to everybody's talks. It was all interesting. Everybody had some very interesting questions as well. So thank you all very much. Just a reminder about the journal club we're planning to hold. Is it once a month, Sharona? And it will be on the Twitter, won't it?
Yeah, we will share it on Twitter. So we will be using the same Twitter from the conference, but just renaming it as the general. So we will be sharing sort of monthly journal club. If it's not going to work out as every month, we'll do it every 2 months. But I think just to keep this conversation going, considering that most people responded positively to our little efforts that we put together this event together. So I think we'll just try to keep it moving as much as we can.
Can I just say a few words to finish off? I just want to thank the speakers again for their input, and today's and previous days as well, if you're watching on on YouTube, and just once again to congratulate the team. I have to point out that even though I'm nominally responsible for most of the people in the team, apart from Tom, I should say, I had very little to do with the organisation of this meeting. This is very much a student-led meeting, and really has been fantastic. And I think will grow as people watch contributions on YouTube. So well done, everybody, on that. I'm not going to pick anybody out because I don't want to embarrass anybody. So yeah, congratulations on that. And I've really been fascinating, and I've learned so much in the last 3 days myself, and stuff I thought I knew about, I didn't even know about. So that's always a good sign, I think, at a conference. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
I think, like always, our organizing committee will stay on a bit longer. Well, we lost Elliot. Elliot went away somewhere. So, hey everyone.
Well done again, everyone. I can.
Thank you.
It was really good, really good. And I know the numbers fluctuated a bit, but you can probably stop recording now, by the way.
All right. Oh gosh.